natural disasters, forced migrations, whatever else. So not to take the house for granted that this issue of living in exile or living on the margins is one that's with all of us, whether you live in New York or someplace else. So with that, I guess I'll just introduce you. Before I printed out his CV before I realized it was like 13 pages and there was no way that I'd be able to highlight all of Michael's incredible achievements. So I'll just give the bare bones at the very top here. Michael was born in Great Neck, New York. He currently lives and works in Chicago. He got his Master's of Science at MIT in Boston and his Bachelor of Arts at Purchase College SUNY in New York. Exhibitions galore, publications galore, group exhibitions galore. I won't go into all the details. I've been a big personal fan of his for a long time. I've taught Parasite ever since I started working here, which is about 10 years ago now. So I guess I'll just start with some very basic kind of questions and then we can just sort of take it from there. If you're in the audience, raise your hand with questions. This is not just a two-person dialogue. We really want to engage all of you since we're so lucky to have the artist with us. And I thought I would just sort of get really basic. Sorry, I'm going to use this as my little desk here. What is Parasite? This is the object in question that we're talking about. What is it, and can you explain its name? That was my other.
It's on. Okay. Well, Parasite is, well, thank you very much, first of all. Thanks to MoMA, and thanks to Shido Prajapati and Pablo Elgar and everybody in education and public programs. And it's really nice to be here and to be in an exhibition with so much great work around it. And the people I'm fans of are in the same room as well. The project is, well, Parasite is a series of inflatable homeless shelters that I custom build for homeless people, and the shelters attached to the exterior ventilation on buildings. So the warm air that's being expelled by the building as part of its heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system simultaneously inflates and heats these double membrane structures. And so what you can see here is that when I say double membrane, it's like basically a network of tubes. So the warm air that's being exhausted by the building never actually comes into contact with the homeless person, so they're not breathing it in. But it warms through conduction. It basically keeps these shelters at the same temperature as the people who are inside who actually have homes are living in. So it's almost like an extruded interior space to the exterior. But I custom build them, and that's a continuing effort, a sustained effort to address the needs and the desires of each person, and not necessarily designed for a statistic. And so the names of each person surface, and their stories also surface.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the name? And actually, I don't think I have something big. If you have one of these handouts, and you can probably even see from here, the way the title is spelled is P-A-R-A, all lowercase, Site, S-I-T-E, all uppercase. And I think that there's double meanings, triple meanings maybe in the name, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
For me, it was like a typographical illustration of the way that the shelters work, of being a kind of like an italic in the city, that it's soft, it has round edges, it basically contrasts and opposes the geometric hard architecture that it's living off of. And in terms of the actual title, I was interested in how that kind of a word initially kind of creates discomfort or agitation for the person who hears the name. But para in French means at or to the it means at or to the side of. In Greek actually, and then in French it means to guard against. And so parachute means to guard against falling. Parapluie, which is an umbrella, means to guard against rain. Parasol means to guard against the sun. And this was a language that was given for devices, like not necessarily just rescue systems, but also just implements. And so I thought about this as a rescue system, but also as an implement, but also it sort of like guards against becoming a site. It guards against becoming permanent, because this is a temporary solution. In fact, it problematizes the problem. And so it's not meant to kind of be an endgame solution where the homeless are simply living off the waste air of the city. So it waits, it's an attendant kind of like design that waits for the imagination and the creativity and the devotion of policymakers and social workers and architects. No skills that I actually have as an artist, you know, but this essentially creates a bandage. And as Krzysztof Wodiczko says about the bandage simultaneously heals, but it also draws attention to the person who sees the bandage that something unacceptable has been visited upon the person. You know, so like in an ideal society, people should not have bandages because they should not have wounds.
Right. And I think another kind of layer to add on that, it's not uncommon to think of the homeless as being parasites off of the rest of culture. They're begging money, they're doing whatever. This is a common kind of critique against them, maybe not a very thoughtful one, but I think that name kind of calls that out too and forces us to think a little bit harder about what causes someone to be homeless. It's not a choice usually. There's many different reasons, mental illness or literally just lack of money or whatever, people fall into it. Legally, it's often the case as well. Laws are in place, for example, that prohibit single-room occupancies anymore. This used to be very common in New York, and it was a way that many people kind of on the verge of homelessness actually would have a place to sleep at night. They've been made illegal because they don't keep up real estate values and whatever else. And so since then, it's another reason why homelessness has skyrocketed. So it's not that people always choose to be homeless for some reason, so to assume they're just parasites living off the rest of us is maybe not thinking further. So that name always, to me, was a kind of critical way to think more deeply about homelessness. And I like the idea that it's guarding against a site. How is that? Let me put some questions out to you all, because it almost seems a little bit counterintuitive to me. Why would we want to guard against a site if we're trying to solve homelessness? Or why would we want this to be a resistance to site if we're trying to resolve homelessness? Exactly. You had a comment too.
Well, that it's a temporary solution until they can get permanent housing.
Exactly. This is a temporary solution. It is not actually a long-term, like the bandage, it's not a long-term solution to homelessness. It's a short-term one. And so we don't want to assume that let's just distribute these to all the homeless people and then somehow the problem is solved, right? So it's not about making this the official permanent site of homelessness or give them a home. It's not a home. It's a temporary solution to a temporary problem. It's a bandage. So I think that at first glance you think, well, we want to give them a site, but that's not what this is. This is to call attention to them as a short-term solution.
Yeah. The other thing I just want to mention is in ancient Greek, parasite was actually a term that was given to somebody who traded entertaining stories or entertainment in exchange for board and food, you know, for like lodging and food. You know, which is one of the things that actually became a big part of this project was as I started to custom build the shelters for people, I would have requests from each person, you know, that like, I want windows, you know, so that people can see me, because I think that this project is less about security and it's more about making me visible to pedestrians to whom I'm already invisible. And then some people would say, oh, I want the tarp on top to be blue, and then the bottom tarp to be green, because that's like the earth and then the sky. And then another guy named Freddie Flynn in Boston requested a shelter that was in the shape of Jabba the Hutt, you know, because he was a huge science fiction fan. And so, so the needs and the desires of each person comes to the surface, like I said. But then, of course, the stories, you know. So a project that was about architecture also became a project about portraiture, you know.
Can you tell us how many you've built and where they've been located and what the reception has been from building and the places where they've
Just so we can all hear, the question is how many have been built, where are they located, and what has been the reception of the landlords, I guess we could say, the buildings to which these are attached, right?
Close to 70 have been custom built for homeless individuals in New York, in Boston, Cambridge, in Baltimore, in Chicago, and then also in Berlin and Ljubljana in Slovenia. And so the reactions that I've witnessed, you know, I don't always get a chance to hear everything that happens with the shelters because I build them and I give them to people, and they're not fixed to any one place. They're mobile. They fit into a small plastic carrier, and the tube is expandable. You know, the lip is expandable, so it can affix itself to large vents and small vents, and so they can use them throughout the city. So it's not any one place that they go to, and sometimes if they have a problem with one building, they'll just go to another one. But the things that I've witnessed, in some cases, building owners have been intrigued with it because it's completely different language of than boxes and sleeping bags. And in one case, there was one homeless man who made the sort of deal with a business owner that if he was able to camp outside and to keep the exterior clean, and clean up after, the people who were dumping things on the sidewalk, he gave him permission to use the shower. So these micro economies or these micro relationships start to open up. In one case, the police actually did arrive, and this was during the years when Giuliani was enforcing anti-homeless laws. And the policemen actually were looking for any kind of loophole where they could allow for the homeless to just sort of live on the city streets without being moved to a city shelter, which is the most unsafe places for them usually. And so in that case, the policeman, kind of winked and said, "You take all the time you need to take your photographs. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" And then he went on to give me a critique on what I could do to make the project better, and to actually break the law better. And so these kinds of stories that open up, and it also starts to illustrate the fact that the different actors in the city are not always the protagonist and the antagonist that we think, And so in some cases, that question about what is the reaction been, from law enforcement, I know that here in New York, it became a big story. This project became a big story in 1999 and 2000, and Giuliani was actually asked to respond to it on the news, but this was after the Sensation exhibition, and so he wasn't going to dare talk about art, And so in the other situations, it could very well be that there are unsympathetic building owners, but it's not a big deal to just move to another place,
Who is funding the project is the question.
Yeah, the thing that's nice is that it's me, and the project budget is rubbish bags and plastic tape. Not even plastic tape anymore. I never have to buy another roll of plastic tape again because I have a heat sealer that I bought in 1999 for $100, and so it's $5 of material cost. And the idea is that it's supposed to reference the fact that these are readily available materials that anybody can get for free. This is a readily available situation on buildings, and given the enormous number of homeless people living in the city, could we one day wake up and find these encampments taking over buildings like Ivy? So that's the kind of agitational edge of the project for the pedestrian. But the idea is that these DIY instructions that are in front of you right now are not actually for you. They get published in street newspapers that the homeless people often sell. And so it gives them the sort of skill set, that it's a very easy, non-mathematical way of building these things, and with materials that they can get themselves. So no organization in their right mind would ever fund this, but I'm also very uninterested in asking for permission about anything.
The actual architecture, for the structure, as lucid as it is, you can find it in a tennis club, along, the East River. They're quite durable. It's interesting to think that obviously, no one could find it in the meantime. There's really seriousness in structures just like this. If structure is the right word, I don't know.
Yeah, no, there is an industry for inflatables, which is kind of what you're saying. But and this is interesting, and we briefly discussed this. But the legacy of inflatable architecture, it has a beautiful moment at the end of modernism. No pun intended. It's the last gasp of modernism. And so the prototypes that they had for inflatable housing that come from people like Arthur Graham and other fanciful theoretical architects, the legacy is those inflatable tennis courts, but those are for people who can afford tennis court memberships, or bouncy castles. And so for me, this grounds the inflatable. And the other thing is that, the repair kit for this is just a roll of tape. You know, like some of these have lasted years and years and years.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your ability to combine your art with real day-to-day problems in our society. What do you see as your biggest challenge in moving ahead with what you're doing? What do you see as your biggest challenge?
I think the biggest challenge is that the problem just becomes worse and worse, you know, and in terms of the challenge, I think that the city is constantly trying to protect itself against people that can't afford to live in it, and that's any city, not just New York City. And, you know, for instance, when I was doing this project in Harvard, not Harvard, but up at MIT and at Harvard Square, there were a series of vents where the homeless were just lying on top of them. And in order to get the homeless to stop lying on top of the vents, they'd ended up putting up a tilted vent on top of the vent so they would just roll down. You know, so the city is constantly trying to, like, you know, protect itself with this fortress architecture. But what this project did is it allowed for them to displace that warm air. You could just hook up to that secondary vent and then, you know, move that hot air around the corner where they could lie down. You know, so for me, it's like it is this relationship of the parasite to the host. Like the host will try to constantly protect itself against the parasite, but then the parasite has to adapt and like continue to find a way, you know, to rethink its relationship or keep its relationship going with the host. You know, so for me, it has more to do with also just like realizing that the intersection of like all these horrible traumas in our world, you know, they intersect at homelessness. So I do a lot of work with Iraq War veterans, and so you know, you want to meet an Iraq War veteran, you look for a homeless person, you know. And in Chicago, there's a new community of homeless that are coming from the Middle East, you know, that are actually not just people who are looking for refugee housing, they're actually out on the streets. You know, so in some ways it's just, it's the weight of all these impossibly, you know, difficult narratives that we're all living in right now. But, you know, it's, for me, I think it's just trying to constantly stay informed on how the city's policies are working to kind of make life difficult for these people and how to work around them.
I'm kind of writing down themes and questions that are emerging from these discussions that I want to circle back to, but I think before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about how it's made, because I think it'll inform the answers to these. So maybe we jump to that and I'll loop back to pick up on some of these threads. So can you tell us, maybe you can want to use this, I don't know, like how exactly did you make this? What are the materials? How does it work, right? Just like the mechanics.
Well, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory here. I'm terrible at math, you know, but somehow I ended up in an architecture program and an art program in an architecture department, and so I took out all these books at MIT about pneumatic architecture. People like Thomas Herzog and Fry Otto, who wrote about pneumatic structures, and they all had diagrams in there that I found really, really hard to follow. You know, and so I just tried to kind of put things together without measuring and really trying to work like a sculptor might work. And so, you know, this is the most basic form of it, and this is the one that can be most easily made if somebody needs to stay warm for a night. You can build this in a few hours. But, you know, it's basically, in this case, like, you know, some tape and some rubbish bags that you cut off the bottoms of the rubbish bags so you can connect one to the other and make a tube. And then you make these vertical sections that connect to these other parts of the horizontal tube. So they come out, you know, and they create this basically like an A-frame. And then the idea is creating like a long enough tube so that, you know, if your vent is, you know, on the second story of the building, you know, you can climb up on a dumpster and still reach it, and so you can, you know, put the intake tube a little further up. So I always make the intake tubes, you know, really long so that they can just adjust to the situation.
Well, how many prototypes did you make before you had an actual?
How many prototypes did he make before he had an actual workable parasite shelter?
2. The first one I made was using contact cement and black trash bags, and that was, and I was in an architecture course. I should say this. It was called Nomadic Design, And you know, architecture students do a really good job of talking each other out of one another's projects. You know, so it was like during one of these critiques, I brought in like drawings of like the shelter, what it would look like in the city, and everyone was saying this won't work. And then I had this like little prototype, and they're saying it won't work. And there were a group of homeless people that I knew, you know, going to and from my studio every day, and I showed them the drawings, and I said, is this just, you know, academic BS? You know, can this work? And then they invited me to their shelter, like the municipal shelter where they stay, and they sat across from me at a table, you know, very, very concerned for me in some ways, that I had this delusional idea. And I told them that I was in this architecture program, and they said, "You're an architect then?" And I said, no, I'm actually an artist in an architecture program. And then they loosened up and they said, okay, so if you're an artist, you're not so far from being like us. But you know, if you were an architect, you'd be studying to make more buildings that we can't afford to live in, you know? And somehow this was an important moment of trust that was gained. And so, you know, I showed them this like this black trash bag prototype, and they said, this looks like a hamburger, you know, and we can't see out of it. And I said, well, I figured you want, you know, privacy. They said, no, we don't have privacy issues, we have security issues. We want to see potential attackers, and if we're going to be participating in this weird project, you know, we would like to finally be seen because we're already invisible. So, you know, for this one guy named Bill Stone, who is actually no longer homeless, visibility was on the way to equality. You know, so this was an important step. You know, so it was important to do a couple of prototypes that didn't work first, and then it was pretty easy at that point. This one was used for about 6 weeks on New York City streets, and then I had to improve it, but this is the first one that I made using the heat sealer. So I was also testing out the equipment, and so this was built for a man named Joe Haywood, who lived down in the lower part of Manhattan, like the financial district. And so, so this is the one that's here, and it bears some of the marks of its use.
How do you decide who to make them for?
How do you decide who to make them for, especially?
It's interesting because it's not one of these projects where I'm just going up to people and saying, would you like one of these? In New York, I mean, in Boston, I explained like the network of people that I built for there, the 15 or so people that I built for there, were people that I was familiar with already, just being another citizen, when we saw each other often enough that we were somewhat familiar. The first time I built one in New York, it was a homeless man that I saw in Penn Station frequently because I was going to visit my parents out on Long Island. And so eventually, you know, the conversation starts, you know, what do you do? You know, and even when I meet, you know, this is the kind of umbrella project that defines most of my work, and so I would tell anybody about this project before I would tell them about anything else, so that, you know, to describe my practice. So I would naturally describe this project, and in a lot of cases, the people that I was talking to would say, I would like one. And in New York, when the project when it first appeared, it was in the New York Times. Because somebody was using it as a kind of like position against Giuliani and his policies. And what I found was that I was getting a lot of calls from homeless people at the Coalition for the Homeless because they put it up on their bulletin board. And so that was how I started to build with a lot of activity here in New York. And Chicago is a very slow start because even though I'm living there, you know, about 9 years now, it's still a new city for me somehow. And so the first person that I built for last year was somebody who's an artist, and he was doing these amazing drawings outside. And I was interested in the pens he was using because I couldn't get those same lines with the pens that I was using. And so he asked me if I was an artist, and then we talked about this project. And so this is a guy named Kevo, and he always draws the trains in Chicago. And so the shelter that I built for him is shaped like a Chicago Red Line train. So, you know, and he actually drew on it, you know, so it actually is the first shelter that I've done that actually has surface treatment on it, but it's his, you know.
Do you know of any shelters that have been built with the instructions?
I don't. Unfortunately, I don't. I can't say that I do know of that.
San Francisco has been quite progressive in dealing with issues of homelessness, and I'm curious to find out if your work is morphed out into
San Francisco, or if you work with Blythe Memorial Church, Reverend Cecil Williams, who actually built like a rooming house to get people actually off the streets, so coming up with actual solutions. So to truncate my question, have you worked in San Francisco and have you dealt with the homeless problem that seems to be very pandemic related? Yes, sir.
I haven't had the opportunity to work in San Francisco with this project yet. Actually, I was just joking with somebody before this. I've been to California twice in my life and never to LA. So, I mean, I would very much like to go and you know, do this project anywhere where people felt as though it was needed. But I also am very aware of the fact that like it's a project that's born out of these direct relationships that I have with people that are around me. And when I have traveled to do it, it usually comes as a request. So in Slovenia, for instance, about 10 years ago, there was an arts organization there that got a message from a homeless man who had seen this project in a magazine. And he wanted one. And so they arranged for me to come over and build this guy a shelter for him and his 4 friends. And that was the first time I ever really traveled for that project to Europe. But you know, I just haven't had the opportunity to spend a long period in the Bay Area. And,
next time I'm going, I'm an artist that works for the corrections department for a youth prison. So I teach kids that are incarcerated from the 14th and 19th. So I travel around a lot. So if you want to come to SF, I'll send you.
yeah, please, let's exchange.
Yeah.
How do you protect against carbon monoxide poisoning?
So it's a double membrane structure, and the air never comes into direct contact with the homeless person. So the air is circulating around.
There's a hole in the bag and they're sleeping there.
If there's a hole in the back,
Hole in the bag inside and they're sleeping there.
it doesn't puncture very easily, but it is the kind of thing where you can see that there's quite a lot of, this is porous over here, and oftentimes they even take the doors off because they find that it can be too warm with the doors, and so that's never actually been an issue.
Sure you found it.
Yeah, no, I don't want to gas people.
One sort of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
What's the process after you give one to someone? Do you check up on it, or do you just sort of send it off?
There are relationships that continue, and then there are relationships where once they get the shelter, they may never want to see me again, you know, and I don't pressure that relationship. There's already a lot of surveillance, and there are other relationships that they might have with social workers and other like city institutions. And so what I've found is that there are some relationships that continue naturally, some even to this day, with people who are no longer on the streets. But I leave that up to them. I don't like this to be something that's colonialistic or heavy-handed in that way.
I wanted to kind of tap into several questions people have asked. It seems like there's a bit of a tension between the fact that these are customized projects. I mean, this is just one type, right? There's all different kinds of shapes to them and colors, whatever, depending on the person. You make them by hand for specific people that you have personal relationships to. So this necessarily limits its scope in terms of how many can be built, where they can be located, whatever else. How do we think about that in relationship to the scale of homelessness? That how many tens of millions of people that are homeless, and the kind of limited scale of something like this?
Well, I mean, this is out there, you know. It exists in quite a lot of street newspapers now. It's on my website. It's also Anonymous did a campaign a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, called Operation Save Winter, and they distribute this around the world. You know, so this is one way where, you know, a project that I don't intend, you know, to necessarily build for every homeless person can actually, you know, be distributed to people because the skill sets are pretty easy and I don't feel any kind of propriety about it. But at the same time, you know, I want to make it very clear, it is a triage instrument, it's not a solution. I sleep in every one of them myself. I always test it out a night or 2 nights. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, it's funny because I've done urban camping, And then when my wife and I got married, she's like an outdoors person. She wanted our honeymoon to be camping in the Southwest, and I was like, no fucking way, you know? Like, I was really scared of doing like Southwest camping. I'm like, I can do this. I can't, you know, like rattlesnakes don't exist in the city, you know? But I also like, I got used to it. I'm a conqueror.
One thing that we've kind of talked about, but I want to bring to the fore a little bit more, is the fact that you really put yourself on the line in a personal way, and you develop relationships with actual homeless people. You talk to them about their needs. You test these things out yourself on the streets. Can you talk a little bit about why you did that, how you feel about that, and how that might be different from more conventional architectural practice?
Why I'm doing them like person to person? Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what I said before, which is that each person has needs, but I also think they have desires. And I think in these spaces of urgency, it's very easy to just think about the needs, and that doesn't leave a lot of room for, you know, other things like love, like poetry, like you know, something that can be more expressive. And I'm not an institution, and I understand that institutions need to work for the statistic and for the mean. But that's not what my training is, and I actually get a lot of joy from working with one person and finding that, you know, those really interesting idiosyncratic connections. Like I could never think, you know, I could never give myself the permission to make a job of the Hut shelter. You know, like it's a 10-year-old fantasy inside myself, but it's like, you know, those are things that I could never predict. There's another instance where this guy named Artie requested a shelter for him and his girlfriend Myra. And so he wanted a bubble area that was going to be the sitting room, and then a low-lying area that was about 18 inches off the ground called the loving room, you know? And, you know, in the middle of building it, he called me and said it wasn't going to work, and so I had to redo the design. And when we met, he said, oh, there needs to be 2 sitting areas because Myra talks too much, and the living room, the loving room needs to be in the middle, and it ended up looking like a bra, you know, or a dog bone. And like, you know, even in these spaces of urgency, you still have these stories that are about love, that are funny, you know, and it's like a guy complaining about, you know, his partner. You know, and so like for me, like those kinds of things don't come to the surface when we're just talking about nameless, faceless homeless. You know, and so each person, it's built for those people and they have names. And so, and that's why I say that, like, you know, it started as architecture, but it became portraiture. You know, and that's interesting because we're in an art museum. Maybe we're not in that kind of an art museum, but like the history of portraiture is like relegated to the aristocracy. You know, and this brings it to a different sort of demographic, different kind of citizenry. You know, and so that for me is one of the reasons. And then I also know what I'm capable of. You know, I don't want to manage an industry. I want to be a poet. I want to be an artist. I want to be able to make those connections that I think are a lot more intimate. Does that?
Well, as a historian that studies the 20th century of architecture, you know, that century is replete with failed examples of housing solutions that don't work. And one of the key reasons is that the designers and the bureaucrats who make those solutions often aren't talking to the people who they're trying to solve the problems of. So, and a lot of it boils down to money, but you end up with these overly small or public housing projects that lack closets or that have skip-stop elevators which are actually very dangerous, or things like this that create these terrible conditions that just make them go downhill. And I think that one of the kind of pioneering aspects of this is the grassroots aspect of actually asking people what they want versus sort of coming in on high as someone with these solutions that's going to impose them on another audience. And I think that's one of the freshest things in my mind about this that architects don't always think to do, at least historically. And that's changing now. We're kind of undergoing a social turn in architecture, but that's more recent than this.
What is the general nature of your other artwork, and does it bear any relationship to this project?
What is the nature of this other artwork? This is only one of 13 pages. And how does it relate to this project?
That's a good question. And without getting too involved with talking about other projects, I think that my concern, you know, around homelessness comes from, you know, other concerns about placelessness and statelessness, and you know, the project was born in Jordan, I was in my first year at MIT, and I actually participated in an architectural residency in the country of Jordan. And my mother's family are Iraqi Jews that had to leave Baghdad in the 1940s. And so I always heard these stories about the city that they loved that they could never go back to. And of course that was complicated even further, like when I felt split down the middle during the first Gulf War, and the place that my grandparents fled from was about to get bombed by the place they fled to. And so when I went to Amman, Jordan, it was the first time somebody in my family had gone back to that region aside from Israel. And so I wanted to do research on some of the architecture of Palestinian refugee camps. And I found a book in the Roach Library at MIT's architecture department, and it had a picture of a refugee camp. And the Palestinian family had rebuilt the facade of their building that had been recently bulldozed by the Israelis. And so they used, like, you know, cardboard, they used metal siding, they used all this detritus that was around them to kind of recreate this thing, which was like an architecture of resistance. And I wanted to go and see more of that. And the country of Jordan didn't, you know, they weren't comfortable with it. So during the residency, I studied the tents and the equipment of the Bedouin. And this was a more romantic version of placelessness or nomadism. And one of the details that I saw was that every night they set up their shelters differently, you know, and it was to account for the direction that the wind was moving in. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, weathermen here can't predict the weather, but they can read the wind, you know? And it was like aerodynamics of sailing. And this was a beautiful poetic detail. And when I got back to the States, I was in Boston, I was walking down Tremont Avenue, and I saw a vent on a building, warm air was coming out of it, and beneath it was a homeless person. He was staying alive. And here were these two different forms of nomadism, those who are nomadic by tradition with the Bedouin, those who are nomadic by consequence as like economic or social refugees in our cities, and then there was wind, you know, and that was where the project was born. Immediately I saw it, right then and there. And so, you know, I wanted to do something about refugees far away, but those people were in my own backyard as well. People who were dispossessed and living in the margins. And a lot of my projects have gone back to that question of refugees. I've been trying to piece together what is left of Iraq by rebuilding the artifacts that were looted and destroyed in the museum, in the National Museum in 2003. And it always comes back down to material. You know, so this material speaks to a certain kind of urgency. The artifacts that I'm rebuilding are made out of like the scraps of Middle Eastern foodstuffs and newspapers that we find here. So these fragments of cultural visibility are being enlisted to make these things that are now invisible and lost. So the materials are also supposed to do some of the work at communicating that. But it's a longer answer to your question than I wanted to give, but I'm still working on this idea of disappearance and also how do we rebuild what isn't there.
And I don't want to push you into a category, but I sort of also view you as part of a larger artistic sort of direction where artists since the 90s are really trying to use their practices and ways to advance certain social politics and to be activists. The type of artwork they pursue, in this case it results in a specific object that would be displayed in a museum, but oftentimes they're more actions. They're not necessarily physical artworks that we might be able to display. So one term for this is called social practice. So would you say that that kind of activism is what binds together your different projects?
I mean, I'm honored to be called an activist. I just worry that it trivializes that word because there are people who are devoted to that as a full-time struggle. And I do think about the poetry first. You know, I have to be honest that like I'm not designing a shelter that can just be moved across the city streets. It has to be tethered to a building. But I'm very interested in that connection. You know, where one building is breathing life into another. You know, that for me is kind of what the project is anchored to. You know, and I think that if there is an activist aspect to it, I'm grateful that that kind of thing can emerge from the work. But I do think that there's that there's an aspect to it that I still, feel very connected to, seeing things from a perspective that isn't always just about, pragmatics and about, effectiveness. Like there's an aspect of usefulness to this. There's an aspect of usefulness to remaking an object. But like, I'm aware that you can't rebuild history. You can't rebuild a rock. It's a sad thing to say, but the place that my grandparents left will never ever be there. And the people who are leaving now, that place that they're leaving now will never ever be there. And this is it's a temporary solution. And I don't mean to sound like a downer. But it is one of those things where I'm looking to kind of agitate and create those platforms for discussion, and to be able to do what Tony Fry calls redirective practice, which is where you start to work outside of your training, and so I can take on archaeology in an unorthodox way because I'm not trained in the orthodoxy there, and I'm not trained as an architect, so I don't have to abide by the orthodoxy there. And I certainly, as an artist, will never ever abide by the orthodoxy of art, and it does exist. So I'm much more interested in like these murky areas where you don't really know that what you're seeing is art.
Right.
And the only reason this is in a museum is because there was one that was no longer being used, and the person who used it wanted it to sort of act the same way that some of the photographs have worked as documentation. And so it exists here as a prototype, but it's very important to realize that this happens. That these things do get used.
What happened to make that control over there? Do you know he didn't sue the subject?
This one?
Yeah, like why did he fix it? What was the problem there?
He cut the tube, because he actually felt like there was too much tube. So he hacked it, and that was...
Yeah, like do they, like you see them 5 years later, are they all hacked that way? Are they all kind of adapted?
There's a lot of adaptations. My favorite one is, what is his name? Bruce Wayne DeVos, who used to be a homeless person living in like the Herald Square area. He didn't like having to get up and pee, so he made a tube that ran out the bottom. It was big enough to put part in, and he ran it down into a drain. No. I mean, like they have to have areas that they feel like they can like tap into.
I mean, at the end of the day, to me, one of the strengths of this project is that it's neither architecture or art or just activism. It's like in an ambiguous territory where it's sort of a little bit of everything. Moreover, as the artist, you don't know if people build these, but maybe in theory, million people have, you just don't know, right? So there's some lack of control, there's an openness to give up artistic control to allow other people to do it, and then also these modifications that people make. I mean, as an artist, how do you feel about that?
I love it. I mean, it's because, again, it's like the things that I can't even predict. Like I become in some way a vessel for these other people. But the first thing that I felt like at MIT when I was doing the project and I was presenting this, my thesis, I felt like it should be Parasite Shelter built by Bill Stone because it was his design. And Parasite Shelter built by George Livingston. The guys were like, no, it's built by you. And we're going to be able to say we got his MIT student to build this thing for us. And it's like a designer kind of thing. And I didn't realize that reverse economy of the word, but like I feel like in some ways I've done the most boring part, which is to come up with the idea, but then they come up, they're the ones who live on the streets. I'm certainly not going to be able to inform, what they need to live, how they're living. And so to be able to design something that can respond to that and adapt to that, is one of those things that has kept the project alive for me. I'm always learning from it, and the problem doesn't disappear, so the project doesn't disappear, but like, I also can honestly say I've never ever lost interest.
What do we think about one of the, we talked about a little bit, just to kind of bring it out a little bit, the fact, someone brought up the fact that this is in MoMA, right? It's no longer on the street, and this was one that had been decommissioned, so to speak. It was not being used on the street, so it's in here, but there's an obvious sort of, a bit of a tension between the fact that this thing is inside a place which is emitting that air, to which none of these are attached on the outside, and so we're viewing it in a certain kind of context that is more elitist in a way, honestly, than what it was originally intended for. What are the pros and cons of that?
You're asking me?
Or anyone.
Well,
Maybe it was just you all, co-author of the things that we're talking about. How many of you have seen one of these in real life? No, this is real life, but how many of you have seen one on the streets? I've seen this one here probably 10 times now. So I think it's about access, actually. Having it here maybe does make these ideas more accessible to the audiences who might have the resources to make more lasting changes, perhaps, right? I mean, that's, to me at least, the value of having it here.
Have any institutions that deal with the homeless approached you to do this on a massive scale?
No, nobody wants to do this on a massive scale. I mean, because nobody is really sure about whether or not it breaks a law. I mean, I know for sure it doesn't, because there are no laws, at least not yet, about what you can do with air, and the idea of recycling air. Also, some of the homeless people in New York actually researched New York City's anti-tent laws, which are attached to anti-camping laws. And a tent, described by New York City, like places that are around 1.1 meters, or 1 meter. And then, so the people in New York mostly were going for like these 18-inch shelters that are a little bit more like inflatable sleeping bags. And so it presented subterfuge or loophole, you know, for the city's, you know, like getting around the city's laws, like Simon says. And so, you know, but what I have done is like when the shelter has been acquired by institutions, like what I'll do instead of like, you know, thinking about how we're so much at a divide about them providing counseling for the homeless and then, you know, getting permanent housing, which really isn't a divide. I want the same thing, but I'm producing a triage object that they usually don't want any part of because of the legal concerns. Like MoMA actually made a donation to the Coalition for the Homeless instead of paying me or my gallery when they bought the shelter. You know, I have to thank MoMA because a museum in Chicago bought one recently, and they were actually able to make a really huge donation to the Coalition for the Homeless in Chicago. You know, so it's been nice to be able to kind of have the project linked to, you know, an economy of people who actually have their boots on the ground and are doing this very hard work in the city to create permanent solutions for the homeless. And so there's that aspect of the circular economy, which I think is tied to my own personal activism, my own ethos, you know, but again, I try to, you know, work on these projects so that the politics and the activism doesn't always lead the work, if that makes sense.
I read your thesis on this before this talk, and you mentioned that you, or at least in your thesis, you had a section on the Russian avant-garde, the Russian constructivism. And I was struck by that because there's another generation of architects also inspired by Russian constructivism, from these kinds of things, and the projects you create look nothing alike. But what I was struck by was what it seemed to me that you took from that was the activist, this kind of artist as producer, author as producer, this kind of idea that the artist can act in the world and try to make change or try to do something different, even if the formal qualities aren't the same. But like the Russians, the formal is important. It's not only activism, it's also still an art object.
Yeah, well, they also recognized the fact that that was important. You know, like they have the best artists in Russia working, you know, for ideas that they really believed in before the revolution betrayed them. You know, and it was the first moment where you can say that history was on the side of the artist. And briefly, right? You know, so I was very, I mean, I was really moved and really attracted, you know, by the Gustav Klutz's radio orators, which were like these pieces of urban furniture that really made use of very, very beautiful avant-garde graphics that would bring people in. And then, of course, it was the propaganda of the Bolshevik Revolution and later on the Soviet state that was being broadcast through these sort of like radio stations on the street. And this is, of course, where, like, as an artist, I become, you know, skeptical of working too directly alongside any movement or, you know, working for a government or anything else, because I never want the work to become sublimated and implicated in policies that actually I don't have any control over. You know, so that for me, you know, is one of those things where I think people living under those regimes and artists who have found themselves caught up in that will often like talk about how, you know, the revolution does sometimes eat its children.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a fundamental sort of gap in a sense between these kinds of ideas that can be enacted on a personal level on a small scale, and then once they become institutionalized on a large scale or at the government level, they lose something of, they lose their essence, I think, in a sense. So yeah, I agree with you about that. I read recently, I was thinking, we had another show in here, some of you probably know, I recognize some familiar faces, but we had a show in here called Uneven Growth last year, which was addressing this idea of social and political inequality around the world. New York was one of the cities that was focused on. And in terms of dealing with the homeless, I read that there's been two sort of laboratories or experiments done in Utah where it was thought, like, is it cheaper to have all these programs to help house the homeless or just to give them a house? Like, instead of shelter systems, the sheltering system in New York City is a profit-making system, a lot of that, so it's not a purely charitable or philanthropic system. So they did two experiments, and it's actually cheaper to just give homeless people housing, like build them housing that has plumbing and whatever else, because the programs we have in place, they require you to meet certain standards, maybe like you have a job or sobriety or whatever else, which are often impossible to achieve unless you have a house. So it becomes a chicken or egg kind of thing. And so I'm always just sort of struck once you move to the institutional level of the kinds of barriers to moving forward that there often are. These two experiments are very small scale. So again, could they be done in New York? You know, probably not. But I think we only have like a few minutes. But I want to take questions from people in the audience.
Someone asked about what you do in your studio other than this, and you got into the story about Jordan, but what other type of creations and creativity do you do?
Yeah, well, one of the projects that another ongoing project are these reconstructions of the artifacts that were looted from the Iraq Museum, and unfortunately that project continues because there's over 8,000 objects that are still missing, but now I've expanded it to include the objects that were destroyed and looted in the Mosul Museum or in Nineveh or any of these other sites because the war continues, you know, and so I think that the other projects that I can talk about, well, I have a wonderful former student, amazing artist and architect in the crowd, Chuck Travieso, who helped me in a project that I did in Brooklyn where I imported Iraqi dates to the U.S. for the first time in over 30 years, and that was 10 years ago that we did that project, and the project ended up being a very beautiful failure, a sad failure, because it actually illustrated the horrible conditions that exist where the Homeland Security, the FDA, and so many other institutions, you know, everything goes into Iraq, but nothing comes out. You know, and it's not just because of the current crisis, but like even during the war when they're supposed to be rehabilitating the country, nothing is coming out except for oil. You know, so like there wasn't any back and forth that was supposed to be happening once the sanctions were lifted. But then the dates actually ended up traveling the exact same path as Iraqi refugees, as they sort of like were volleyed back and forth from the border with Jordan, and we ended up getting like 10 boxes instead of the 1 ton that we ordered, you know. So I'm interested in those projects that can, you know, do something like enacted almost like a quotidian, small market storefront on Atlantic Avenue, which is New York's Arab heart, but at the same time, it was like doing something that was as ridiculous as trying to get dates from Iraq, you know, and so I'm interested in those moments where absurdity can happen, but also you're not so sure that it's art right away.
I'm going to end with a question. Since we're in an exhibition called Endless House, this project seems to be somewhat endless in the sense that you've been working on it for almost 20 years, it seems like, at this point, and you've mentioned that you've never gotten bored of it. It's still like an ongoing project. Do you ever see a point in time where it would end, or you would want to leave it behind, or do you feel ever, not burdened by it, maybe too strong a word, but sort of, you know, the idea of keeping on a perpetual project?
Well, for me, this is a commitment, you know, and I feel strongly about commitments. I think that it's one thing that frustrates me very much is the way that news cycles work. I think it's very violent, you know, to be able to kind of like spend 2 days talking about, you know, the photograph of a Syrian boy who ends up washed ashore, and that becomes like our way of dealing with the crisis, but then we just move on. And I've even been, you know, in reviews that people have written about my work, people say like Iraq has moved out of the news cycle, but for some reason Michael Rakowitz is still making work about it. You know, that kind of thing I think is really vulgar, you know, and I think that the one thing that I can do is to commit to those things that I do find important, and maybe that is where the activism is. You know, maybe the constant labor is a form of activism, you know, but I certainly feel strongly enough about the personal ties that I've made in these communities, and I feel strongly enough that this dispossession on our streets, there's a not so invisible line that ties them to the dispossession that we're talking about in Syria and other places, and I think that for me, that's one of the reasons to keep going.
We'll end there, so keep with my metaphor of ending. So I want to thank all of you for coming out, and a big round of applause for Michael. We're just really lucky to have him here. And take a few individual questions if people want to come up for a minute or two. So thank you.
Yeah.